we're talking about a long-standing U.S. ally, and obviously what I'm going to discuss today puts all of that into question and certainly raises troubling questions about how to proceed moving forward in light of where the Turks stand vis-a-vis their policies in the Middle East. The first issue that I would probably raise is if we're going to take this kind of chronologically, if you were following the so-called flotilla that took place roughly 4 years ago, it was probably the first indication that there was a major problem. That 2010 flotilla to Gaza that was sponsored by the Turks was shepherded by an organization called the IHH. The IHH, for anyone who'd been following it in the past, has multiple ties to Hamas, that some of the figures have been closely tied to it, that there have been questions in the past about financing of Hamas through a larger charity called the Union of Good. There were alleged al-Qaeda connections, or at least al-Qaeda concerns, that had been voiced by the CIA dating back to the 1990s. And here you have an organization that is now being fully embraced by the Turkish government to essentially bring aid and comfort to the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. Now, having sort of unpacked that and understanding that there are terrorism ties and terrorism concerns, this ultimately raised some questions about whether, in fact, the Turkish government supported Hamas in any significant way. And the answer that we found in our research is that absolutely that has been the case, that since the rise of Tayyip Erdogan, who was, of course, prime minister for 2 terms and is now the president of Turkey, and he's really adopted kind of a Putin model, which we can certainly get to later. But under Erdogan, ties have drawn closer between Hamas and the Turkish government. This includes what I would call material support, a lot of construction assistance, the building of hospitals and mosques and other infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, but also reports of cash transfers. These are, of course, not easy to verify in light of the fact that it's not as if Hamas registers or settles up every year with Ernst & Young in terms of who they're receiving their funds from, but there was certainly a sense that the ties have deepened between the Turkish government, and that there could in fact be some significant financial ties as well. And just to put a finer note on these Hamas ties before we move on, there was, I think this summer, a very strong indication of how close Turkey has drawn to Hamas. In particular, there's one individual that we've been tracking for the last 2 years. His name is Salah al-Aruri, A-R-U-R-I. He was transferred to Turkey in advance of the Gilad Shalit deal. After the deal was struck, another dozen or so Hamas members found their way to Turkey as well. But Aruri is, without question, the leader of Hamas in Turkey right now. He was responsible, as we now know, for planning and perhaps even financing that attack, the kidnapping of those 3 teens in the West Bank in June, and obviously their murder as well. We also heard about Salah Aruri as the war dragged on with Gaza into the summer, and we certainly we saw him take responsibility for that kidnapping and murder. And he did so in front of the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey at a massive Islamist conference that took place in Istanbul. So somewhat shocking that he would be so open about it, but nevertheless, he was. One other note about Aruri, the Israelis reported that he was planning an operation in which the Hamas hoped to spread the unrest from the Gaza Strip, and what we saw to a certain extent in Jerusalem this summer, that it would spread into the West Bank, and that Hamas hoped to leverage that unrest to bring down the government of Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. So this is Salah Aruri. He is a senior Hamas leader. He is based in Turkey to this day and plays a significant role. Some have even said that he could be number 2 within the Politburo of Hamas, right behind Khalid Meshal in terms of succession and leadership. And so there are significant ties, first tipped off by the IHH flotilla, but certainly I think it's now safe to say that Turkey serves as one of the external headquarters for Hamas. And again, we have to ask the question of whether, if in fact we have the planning and financing of operations that take place on Turkish soil, what does this mean for the legal liability, and certainly what does it mean for the NATO status of a country like Turkey when it has these activities that are taking place? Another area of significant concern that we've been tracking is the financial relationship that the Turks have had with Iran over the last couple of years. Obviously, everybody knows that there has been a significant sanctions infrastructure that has been built, an architecture that has been painstakingly put in place by the U.S. Congress and by the administration to isolate Iran financially as it continues to push for this illicit nuclear program. One of the things that we learned was between 2012 and 2013, the Turks had found a way of circumventing those sanctions legally by allowing the Iranians to sell oil or gas to the Turks in exchange not for cash, which would have been illegal, but in exchange for gold. And so this was what we now call the gas for gold scheme. That this was done quietly for several months, and then even after it was discovered, it was legal until Congress closed that loophole. It yielded Iran some $12 or $13 billion in sanctions busting. This is a huge amount of money in light of how much had already been captured through the sanctions dragnet. It roughly was about half of Iran's proven accessible cash reserves. So in other words, this was a huge boost to the Iranians right at the time where we were really trying to gain that leverage over them. And we have also since learned, according to a leaked prosecutor's report in March, unverified by the U.S. government but widely believed to be authentic, this prosecutor's report alleged another $100 billion worth of transactions between Turkey and Iran. Many of these were done through classic money laundering techniques and sanctions evasions. These were not technically legal at all. In fact, if they are proven, these were very much illegal and I think certainly prosecutable, but we are not seeing any action on the part of the Turks to chase down the individuals or companies. In fact, many of them have been let off the hook. But again, what we're talking about is potentially more than $100 billion worth of sanctions busting activity over these last couple of years. And this, of course, raises a lot of interesting questions because, of course, the Iranians are the primary patrons for the Assad regime in Syria. And so if the Turks were helping the cash flow to Iran, there's no question that the money would then in turn flow back into Syria. And that is where, of course, the Turks have been, I think, very committed to bringing down the regime of Bashar al-Assad. They've been so committed in doing so that we have now seen a very troubling trend emerge, that the border, the 560-mile border between Syria and Turkey, has essentially become a jurisdiction for illicit finance, unlike anything we have seen in the last 10 years. I think the closest thing we've seen to it is the role of Pakistan in assisting the Taliban, and I think actually there have been at least 3 or 4 different analysts in Turkey and Europe that have made this direct distinction. What we're talking about is a border that has been explicitly used for the transfer of fighters, the transfer of cash, the transfer of weapons and other material into Syria, and this includes for groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, like Ahrar al-Sham, the Islamic Front, and even ISIS, that we have seen this. Reports have surfaced time and again that this is something that the Turks are either allowing to happen tacitly or even explicitly, where Turkish guards will literally let bearded fighters with guns across the border. And then on top of that, there is the oil smuggling that ISIS has been doing, where it is sold across the border into Turkey through middlemen who then resell it again in Turkey. This has been a huge moneymaker for ISIS. In other words, the Turks are involved in an illicit financial pipeline. And then, of course, we also hear about the material support of ISIS fighters who cross back into Turkey to either replenish their finances, to gain more weapons, or in some cases to have a hospital stay if they've been injured. And so a lot of concern there on that Turkish border. And then just a couple of other points that I think are worth noting. There have been multiple reports, all unconfirmed, but I think still worth noting, that Yassin al-Qadi, who is someone who is on the U.S. Terrorism list maintained by the U.S. Treasury for his al-Qaeda ties. There have been multiple reports that have appeared in the Turkish press that he has a relationship with the Turkish leadership. Again, it's difficult to discern exactly what he's doing and whether anything is in fact illegal, but it is something that is of deep concern as he is maintained on our list. He's been dropped by the UN list after a series of appeals, but he certainly is still an illegal person here in the United States, and it does appear that the Turkish government on some level has been working with him, or individuals within the Turkish government. And this, of course, points to a broader question of whether the Turks are serious about fighting al-Qaeda. If you look at their own laws, they are very much out of step with the international standards. There is a group called the Financial Action Task Force, which kind of serves as the UN of terror financing, if you will. The FATF has for 7 years identified the Turks as being out of compliance. This is, of course, deeply troubling that the Turks have not taken this seriously. They are the only NATO member to be out of compliance, and they do not seem to be taking the drastic steps that are needed to redress the situation. They're taking smaller steps to keep them out of permanent trouble that would put them on the same list as, for example, Iran or North Korea. They're a step or two shy of that based on the minimal steps that they've taken. So essentially what we're saying, and I'll just summarize here, is that Turkey has become a significant jurisdiction of terrorism finance concern and activity, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Iran sanctions busting, whether it's the jihadi problem in Syria, whether it's these troubling reports of al-Qaeda personnel, and of course the Financial Action Task Force. All of these things paint a very troubling picture, one that I think has largely been unaddressed by this administration, at least publicly. We're aware of what appear to be private discussions that have put Turkey on notice, but I think in light of how dangerous all of these indicators are, it seems that we should be taking more drastic steps with the Turks, particularly now as they drag their feet in joining the anti-ISIS coalition. As you probably all know, the Turks are not active participants in the strikes against ISIS. They refuse to allow their bases to be used. In fact, if you've been following what's been happening in Kobani, the Turkish military has actually looked on, doing nothing, while ISIS has besieged this Kurdish town. And so again, we're looking at a troubling big picture, one that I think needs to raise the right questions now about whether the Turks still qualify as allies, and more importantly, what we should be doing here in the United States in terms of refashioning our policy with regard to Turkey as an ally. So the various militaries involved in Turkey are in NATO are generally reticent, that they don't want to take these very political steps when they are in fact, the militaries try to be apolitical organizations. And so quietly we're hearing from the political classes in some of these European countries that they're deeply concerned and frustrated. But the real challenge here is that if you look at NATO's bylaws, there are rules and regulations for adding countries. But there is nothing that I've been able to identify that describes how to shed countries from the roster. And so one of the initial studies that we've done is to sort of call into question, well, how would one go about doing this? I think the answer is to look at other multinational organizations that have kicked people out, kicked members out in the past, to see whether that might apply to NATO. But I think what we're talking about is a very complicated process, and one again that I think that none of these countries really want to engage in, because they're deeply concerned about what it would mean if you, for example, kick out Turkey. Does that mean that it becomes something more along the lines of an Iran, and that it's no longer that buffer between Europe and the Middle East, which is as it has always served? So these are issues that are, I think, very troubling and very difficult and very sensitive. I should just say this, that I recently wrote a piece for Politico that at least explained why Turkey could be kicked out, or whether this is something that they should consider. My goal here, though, is not to see Turkey leave the U.S. alliance. My goal is to actually see Turkey stop with some of these policies, that they would begin to change or to alter their path in a way that would satisfy the U.S. relationship and that NATO relationship. We want Turkey to remain, but as a tried and true ally, not one that is engaging in this duplicitous behavior, which would, of course, ultimately lead it to probably exit NATO. So again, the idea here is to reform, not to make things so that you no longer have a relationship. Well, it's an important question, because, of course, the Kurds are the ones who are really taking a good bit of the brunt of the ISIS onslaught, and I should say that that the Kurds are also furious that the Turks are not coming to their assistance in places like Kobani. They're now letting some KRG fighters come in from Iraq, but there's been a lot of ambivalence on the part of the Turks in terms of supporting the Kurdish efforts to defend themselves. But even more broadly than that, it's important to note that when we talk about that open border policy that I discussed, the fact that there are multiple reports of jihadis streaming across that border into Syria, that the Kurds believe that this is a dual-pronged strategy. They believe that the Turks are not only trying to bring down Assad, but they're using these jihadis also to attack the Kurds, and they believe that this is a conspiracy. And it's very difficult to dissuade them of this in light of the animus that has long existed between the Kurds and the Turks. And so, and it also comes at a very, very sensitive time. The peace process that has been ongoing since the arrest of Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, that there were these peace talks that were taking place between the Kurds and the Turks. These have entered into a very rocky period in light of the distrust that is growing. But I think you point out something that's very important here, that the United States and I think the American public does seem to be squarely behind the Kurds. There is, I think, a good amount of sympathy that has been generated for the Kurds as a result of this ISIS crisis. And there's even been some talk among some of the analysts that perhaps it's time for the United States to move its assets out of Incirlik, that traditional NATO base in eastern Turkey, and to perhaps do more out of Erbil. And to give the Kurds that kind of military support that they need, and for ISIS to know that the United States is based there and defending their territory. There's obviously also a lot of talk about granting the Kurds independence, particularly as the map does appear to be changing significantly. I mean, Syria does not exist as a state any longer, one could argue. The same could go for Iraq, in light of the fact that ISIS has conquered these territories and the lines are really blurring quite a bit. So there are a lot of interesting questions that are being asked right now. I don't see necessarily any clear answers, but I do see some interesting trends in support of the Kurds, and I certainly see Turkey's stock plummeting as a result of the policies that they've adopted, both with regard to the border and with regard to the lack of support they're providing to the Kurds. Sure. I mean, look, I think what you're referring to is what is broadly described as the Turkish lobby. Look, I can't tell you how much of an impact it's having or not having. I do know that Turkey, again, has its supporters in this country on Capitol Hill, and it is largely due to the past track record, not the current activity. And I think it's important to make that distinction. And when we are asked to brief the various folks around town here in Washington, we are very explicit about that there is the Turkey that we have long relied upon up until the rise of the AKP, and now there is a different kind of Turkey, unfortunately, and one that we think is going down the wrong path and needs to be engaged and reformed. So that distinction is the important one. We continue to stress this. I can tell you that, for example, in the aftermath of the Gaza war this summer, I was asked to testify before a joint subcommittee hearing for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and there were a lot of questions that came out of that with regard to the Turks' role in supporting Hamas. There is a lot of congressional interest right now in making sure that the Turks halt this activity, and potentially even that they would be sanctioned for it, and not necessarily the government itself, but entities within Turkey through targeted financial sanctions. There was a significant amount of interest there, and so I think there does need to be, an education effort, both with the American public and with American decision makers, to stress that this change has undoubtedly taken place, and that the old model of Turkey is not one that we are seeing anymore, that there is a new Turkey that does not fit our expectations, and we have to adjust. It's a good question. I mean, look, the thing that you need to remember in an increasingly complex Middle East is that, everybody's got a role in the way that they look at the Sunni axis and the way they look at the Iranian axis. The Turks, even though they had this brief interlude with regard to Iran sanctions busting, I think they truly believed that they could keep Iran engaged and happy on the finance front while trying to bring down the Assad regime. What we're now seeing is a souring of relations between the Turks and the Iranians. I think that they appear anyway to be in something of a crisis mode, and that is because the Turks have absolutely made it crystal clear that their number one goal is to bring down the Assad regime, and of course the Assad regime is that huge asset for Iran. And so as far as Russia is concerned, they have been backing the Assad regime. They have done so with finances. They've done so through weapons. They've done so through political cover at the UN. I believe that Russia truly has made its bed with the Iranian axis, and this puts them it puts them on opposite footing than the Turks, and I believe that the tensions are certainly there. I don't see the overt tension, but I certainly would never call them allies here. They are certainly seeking different outcomes in what is seen as, I think, a quiet war in some ways that's taking place across the region. Sure. Look, I think part of the big problem right now with the Turks is that they are very unhappy with our policy vis-a-vis Syria. And to be very fair, I've been obviously very critical of Turkey's foreign policy. To be very fair, they have a point on at least one issue, and that is that we have given up the idea of bringing down Bashar al-Assad. I was in Turkey after the chemical weapons attack on Ghouta, when that became clear that our so-called red line had been crossed. And in talking with Turkish officials, they were flabbergasted and irate that the United States was not making good on that red line promise and not taking action to bring down the Assad regime. And so for a country that does see the Assad regime as a problem in the Middle East, and rightly so. I mean, again, you've got to see the fact here that Assad is an ally of Iran. It is part of the Axis. It is a state sponsor of terrorism that has been back. I mean, it had the headquarters for Hamas. It continues to play a crucial role in the arming and financing of Hezbollah. That Syria was a huge transit point for many of the jihadis that fought the American men and women in uniform in Iraq. In other words, this is not a good actor. And so, in theory, we should actually be able to agree on a way of arming the moderate opposition and vetting and working with the Turks to bring down Assad. We have not done that. And that's one of the reasons why they've gone their own way. They are allowing that border to stay open, and they are tacitly or explicitly working with ISIS and Nusra and everyone else because they do not see any other way for this regime to be brought down. And so I think we probably could find some middle ground with the Turks on this if we were to adopt a more sensible Syria policy. The problem is that in light of our reticence, in light of the knot that we have tied ourselves in over these last 2 or 3 years with regard to Syria, we now don't really have a way forward. I think we could certainly find one, perhaps even with new leadership in Congress right now, but certainly the president does not seem very comfortable with taking military action. I think, by the way, a lot of this has to do with reticence of scuttling an Iranian nuclear deal, that if you go in and you start toppling Assad, well, then the Iranians will walk away from the table on the nuclear issue. But nevertheless, I mean, there are some ways forward. We could probably find a way of working with them. The other thing is, look, we can work through NATO, where we could say, look, you have a border problem. You don't blame them necessarily for the border problem, but what you do is you come up with solutions, an integrated defense system along that border, which would include potentially, NATO personnel. Fences that can be, I think, rather easily built. You could probably stand something up within a few months. I think the Turks would have a hard time arguing with that, if it would certainly benefit their security in the long run as well. So I think there are ways of getting at this, but you do need to understand that we at least play some role here in the United States for having a failed Syria policy that has left our allies, not just Turkey, by the way, but also, the Saudis and the Qataris and a bunch of others. They're furious with us because we've not taken any action to hasten the demise of Assad. Sure. Well, look, first of all, I mean, I think the administration from the get-go has been extremely reticent to back even the FSA, primarily for not just the reasons you discussed as being, anti-Israel, but certainly seeing extremists among them. We had a visit here by, let's just say, unnamed members of the opposition, not only FSA but others as well. And there was a lot of concern that we had Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist groups, not quite, Al-Qaeda, not Salafi, but certainly those that we wouldn't necessarily want to see come to power. And by the way, it's exactly those types that Erdogan does want to see come to power, because if you recall, the AKP in Turkey is essentially an extension or even an arm or a part of the broader Muslim Brotherhood movement. They would like to see Assad fall, and they would love to see the installment of a Muslim Brotherhood regime. And so that also explains some of the complexity here as we sort of think about what we want and what we don't want. And so I understand why the administration has been nervous about the FSA and other groups. I understand why you would be nervous about them. Look, the point is that we do eventually need to find someone that we can work with. I think we've had a hard time doing that. And in the process, we have allowed Syria to fester to a place where you've got more than 200,000 deaths. You've got, many, many more unreported deaths, by the way, that I think we'll eventually find out about. Huge amounts of casualties and injuries, and then not to mention a massive refugee problem. And so the longer we fiddle, the more Syria will burn, and that is a problem that we're going to have to address. And sometimes you got to make sure that the perfect doesn't get in the way of the good in terms of finding those who can bring down Assad, as long as you have at least some way of trying to steer things into a soft landing. And again, it's easier said than done. And it's been part of the problem, but I can tell you that the inaction, because we haven't found the right people to work with, has certainly led us to this mess where we are today. Now, as for going directly with the Kurds and running with them, look, there are those who are going to be problematic even within the Kurds. That there is the PKK and the Syrian arm of the PKK, the YPD, and others that will ultimately also raise eyebrows about whether we should be providing them with arms and weapons and the like. even when you're working with the Kurds, you're going to have to vet the Kurds. Unless you start to take down these designations and say that it's really no longer our problem if there's PKK because they don't represent a threat to us. But at least right now, according to to sort of our laws, we're going to have to work through some of these issues in order to get our weapons to the right people. And so, look, I think the broader point that I would make here is that Turkey's policies have been extremely, extremely dangerous, counterproductive, and run counter to American values. There is no question about that. I think there is also, it should be said in the same breath, that the complexities with regard to Syria in particular make it such that you understand why the Turks are doing what they're doing, you understand what motivates them, but it does not excuse it at all. And we need to work with the Turks, especially on that border issue, to make sure that they do no more harm to a very messy situation already. My sense, and I have a piece that will be coming out, I hope, in the Australian tomorrow, my major sense is that if we were able to shut down that border between Syria and Turkey, we could probably deprive ISIS of a huge amount of its weapons and cash and fighters, and that would be a major first step toward the defeat of this jihadi organization.